They've got a secret for making the Conservative Party popular, which they've kept underneath the bed. They waited till now. Now they're going to reveal what exactly it was that they could have done before they governed for 49 days and lost office and then lost their seats.
Here we are again then. It is How to Win an Election with me, Matt Chorley, joined by New Labour Mastermind Peter Mandelson, Polly Mackenzie's Policy Mackenzie, former Director of Policy for Nick Clegg, and Tory Brainbox Daniel Finkelstein. If you would like to get in touch, you can email howtowin@thetimes.co.uk or you can WhatsApp 0333 003 2353. Now, we've had
I think satire is dead. The idea of a group of people, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Liz Truss, having just lost their seat, having anything called popular conservatism. I mean, to be quite honest, calling it that to start off with, just absolutely extraordinary.
So this is the a conference being held today in Westminster. It's Liz Truss's Popular Conservatives with Suella Braverman, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Lord Foss. So that's two people who lost their
Conservatives
seats.
aren't even popular with Suella Braverman, it turns out.
She hates them.
She doesn't seem to be very popular with them either.
No, I think the feeling is definitely mutual.
They just mean pop, maybe, like fizzy pop, panda pops.
PopCon.
Yeah.
I think what they're saying is that they've got a secret for making the Conservative Party popular, which they've kept underneath the bed. They waited till now. Now they're going to reveal what exactly it was that they could have done before they governed for 49 days and lost office and then lost their seats.
Proving once again that Liz Truss was a long-term Liberal Democrat sleeper agent.
That's the only explanation.
Well, no, if she'd been in the Liberal Democrats, she would have won her seat.
Maybe she should have gone back.
That's sacrifice for the cause. That's what undercover agents do, Danny.
But it's, obviously, while there's a humour about it, it's obviously infuriating as well, because it's an insult to the electorate and to other Conservatives to set about holding a conference called that.
Well, anyway, there we are. Would you like to take your minds off Liz Truss's Popular Conservatives by hearing a new version of the How to Win an Election theme song?
Oh, please, let's.
Now, we have had it on a church organ. We've had it on the kazoo. We've had it on the start of the Smiths and Barry White. Listeners have played it on their head and gargled it. But for the first time, this is a UK drill version sent in by Philip Andrew Heyman.
I love it when people talk in depth about policy.
There's a different matter when it comes to saying what you really think.
I thought you said that we were never going to mention that thing about Keir Starmer losing a few pounds again. Did we?
1 million downloads.
What does everyone who's in Parliament do?
1 million
Keir
downloads.
Starmer losing a few pounds again. They don't want any big beasts coming back to market.
I just thought it's fine if you're doing it on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh.
Hang on, let me just check my contract.
I love it when people talk in depth about policy.
What does everyone who's in Parliament do?
They don't want any big beasts coming back to mark anyone's homework.
I think we might have chased off the last of the listeners. Congratulations if you got through that. Now, there's some debate, Peter. I'm sure you can settle this. There is some debate as to whether or not that is actually drill. What is your view?
Drill? What do you mean drill?
That's what that style of music is.
Is it?
Is
I think possibly I'm the wrong. I think I'm the wrong person.
Is it grime adjacent?
I
drill?
haven't recovered from once telling my children I thought heavy metal was Led Zeppelin, and they since then they've never let me categorise any music. So I better not do this.
Polly, is that drill?
I mean, when I was a child, I used to listen to Neil Sedaka.
Right.
So I think that my taste in music shouldn't really be.
I want to know whether these
Taken
other two
seriously.
have ever heard of drill. Have you ever heard of drill?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Oh, yeah, well, yes.
I've
yes,
heard of it,
yes.
and what I've experienced of it, I did not necessarily enjoy, which aligned with that.
But you're supposed to be like in a dark room, and it's supposed to be louder, and you're probably supposed to have taken some mind-altering drugs, right? Like, and I can imagine a sort of experience, a bit like Tibetan sound baths, but louder.
Do I live in a different universe?
Yes.
You're just old, Peter. You're just old.
I assume that was a question for us, Tom.
Mike's been in touch
purely
saying,
rhetorical question.
Mike's been in touch saying, bring back the bagpipes. David said, I didn't think that the theme tune could get any worse. It turns out I was wrong. Anyway, thank you, Philip, for going to that trouble. Philip Badger-Heyman, wasn't it? Is that his name? The least drill name I've ever heard. But anyway, there we are. If you want to get in touch with a better version, 0333 003 2353. Can we play the other one before the end? We've got a nicer... What's the no, not the piano one. The Punjabi version. There we are. That's what you call trailing ahead. Before the end of today's episode of How to Win an Election, the Punjabi version of the theme tune. Anyway, should we get down to business? Rachel Reeves, remember her? She gave her first speech as Chancellor yesterday. Here is a little bit of it.
Let me address the inheritance. I have repeatedly warned that whoever won the general election would inherit the worst set of circumstances since the Second World War. What I have seen in the past 72 hours has only confirmed that. Our economy has been held back by decisions deferred and decisions ducked. We face the legacy of 14 years of chaos and economic irresponsibility.
So she's basically doing what she said we were talking about she should do last week. Compare that to George Osborne delivering his emergency budget shortly after the coalition took office in 2010.
This is an emergency budget, so let me speak plainly about the emergency that we face. The coalition government has inherited from its predecessor the largest budget deficit of any economy in Europe, with the single exception of Ireland. £1 in every 4 we spend is being borrowed. What we have not inherited from our predecessor is a credible plan to reduce their record deficit.
So she's doing what we said last week she needed to do, Danny.
Yes, it was. She is. I mean, I would certainly argue that the fiscal situation in 2010 was worse than the one that she inherited, and also that she pretty much knew what she was going to inherit, as indeed did George in 2010. So you can't pretend that you found out something new. In 2010 there wasn't an OBR, there is now, so I think Rachel Reeves knew what she had, but strategically, obviously, it's the correct thing to do. You want to try to suggest you're getting through a lot of things quickly, so I have no objection to this strategic manoeuvre, but we can all see it for what it is.
I think Kenneth Clarke was the first person who said this is the worst set of economic conditions to have been inherited by an incoming government since the war. So they're both right about that. What was striking after Rachel's speech yesterday was the sort of cacophony of Tory party supporting think tanks who weighed in and praised her, hailing her speech. I mean, the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute, the Taxpayers Alliance, I think there were a couple of others too, CPS, all saying, thank goodness she's identified what needs to be done if we're going to restart growth in this country. They praised her supply side measures, her housing targets, her reforms of the planning system. I mean, if only their own government had done all this a little bit more consistently over the last 14 years, we probably wouldn't be in quite the state we're in. But I think that what she is doing is laying out the battleground for the political fight that we're going to see for the next 2-3 years. I mean, this audit that she's going to do of all the profligacy and waste and mismanagement of public spending and the state of our public services, I think is the right thing to do from the Labour Party's point of view, and it will be the battleground on which the sort of political fight is carried out. I would say one other thing, though, without sounding too sort of competitive in relation to France. I think that if the incoming government gets all these moving parts in the right place and is able to create strong political and financial stability, the contrast that international investors are going to draw between our country and that of France, given what's happening there, I think is going to benefit us very significantly indeed. I mean, let's just be clear that Macron, when he came to office, I mean, his whole strategy was to sort of claim back the centre ground of politics from the left and the right. What he has succeeded in doing is completely shredding the centre ground of French politics and empowering the extreme left and the extreme right. I take absolutely no comfort from that whatsoever. I think it's a disaster. But economically and financially, it's going to put Britain at an advantage over France.
Is it a good thing to have all those right-wing think tanks lined up behind you at this stage, do you think, Polly?
Well, it's clear Labour is going to continue trying to hold to the centre, as Peter predicted, right? That the fear that the Conservatives tried to push was that the Labour Party would run somewhere in the centre and then, as soon as they were in, go around being socialists, right? And we know that there is a big degrowth movement on the progressive left. And yet, Rachel Reeves has spoken confidently and articulately about the need to bring growth back. So she is positioning herself exactly where they said they would be. They're unleashing their sort of, 100-day plan. But this rhetoric, I mean, it's completely necessary. It's basic politics. But the idea that, they're going to do some amazing new audit of all of the inefficiency, like, oh, come on. Governments always say that. And actually, I think it's kind of pandering.
This time it's going to be done thoroughly, Polly.
There is always changes in policy that you can make, right? But I think you're doing the electorate of disservice if you just say, oh, it's all efficiency. There is that, we'll get some business people in and stop all the waste and be more efficient. And you get this cycle, say, in the NHS, where everyone says, oh, we need to put all of the money back to the front line, and they abolish all the bureaucrats. And then they go, oh, well, nurses are spending all of their time doing paperwork and filling in forms. What we really need is some support workers, also known as bureaucrats. And so, sometimes the political rhetoric does end up getting turned into nonsense, right, in order to fit a narrative that we've taken 5% efficiencies. Actually, there are always choices you can make, but and we are not in the worst fiscal position since the Second World War, but she was very clear. She just sort of said the worst circumstances. She didn't even say economic circumstances. So, I mean, how are we categorising this? It's sort of fair enough, right?
Yeah.
It's an indisputable claim. But there are hugely, hugely difficult challenges, especially if they stick to that promise not to raise taxes, because what we've got penciled in are basically massive cuts to all of the departments that are responsible for, our schools and our hospitals and our roads and our defence. And already we've seen today, say, defence chiefs coming out saying that we need more money for the army. It is not a magic there's no magic solution from an efficiency audit. Let's not lie.
Although I suppose the difference is that in the run-up to the election, the Tories were going around saying the same thing. So it was terrible, all this money we've been wasting. We could definitely find some efficiency.
The Tories are also silly. Yeah, I agree.
Politically, this is obviously the first week of the next general election. I'm going to say something that listeners will greet with scepticism, but I saw a really interesting video of Gavin Williamson the other day. So now that I've drawn you all in by that sentence,
if the drill music didn't finish them off.
What was interesting is he'd begun to oppose what Rachel Reeves was saying on planning. This is interesting for two reasons. First of all, obviously there was a battle inside the Conservative Party, which I think common sense lost over planning and housing. What happened then was places that the Conservative Party lost a lot of these places that it was trying to defend by resisting the Liberal Democrats on housing. It lost those seats anyway. But what also happened, so partly it was interesting to see that continue in what Gavin Williamson had to say. But the other thing that was interesting is what I think we'll see in opposition. When you're in opposition, you end up with your spokesman in Parliament feeling that there's something they have to say in response to government statements. So they just take the other side of the argument, whatever the argument would be. Let's say that Labour says we're going to build on ugly parts of the Green Belt. The Conservative Party will then find reasons why that's a bad idea. And you can always find reasons why everything's a bad idea. And you end up with a collection of policies that are quite incoherent, created by your party spokesman, and are not necessarily correct positions or ones that you want to take. And you start to do that quite early. And the reason why that video was interesting is that, most Conservatives are not already doing that because they're just sleeping and things like that, but he had started doing that, and it is an absolute mistake, and they've really got to try to stop doing
There's
that.
another dimension to this as well. There's going to be a very sobering, salutary experience for very many first-time Labour MPs who are going to go back to their constituencies and discover what it's like to be on the receiving end of vociferous groups complaining about development of housing or infrastructure or whatever it is in their backyard. It's very easy to be in favour of all these things when it's in somebody else's backyard, but when it's in yours, that's a different matter. And they are going to, having been campaigning in opposition and probably more often than not aligned themselves with these complaining groups in order to curry favour with different groups in their would-be constituencies, they're now going to find themselves with all these groups against them and against these developments. And how they react to that and how they face down this vociferous opposition is going to
so
be
tempting for the Tories,
really,
right?
really sobering. If you think, as I do, that the housing shortage is the biggest source of generational inequality in our country, you've got to face up to this,
And it's the
and
biggest
you've got
temptation for the Tories, right? So here is a political party that's on its knees, and suddenly there will come along these big groups in their local areas who are saying something against the Labour MP and against the Labour government. It's very hard to think it's not in the national interest.
Bandwagon.
It's not in the national interest to champion them, and you end up creating your policy, to support the road hauliers against Tony Blair, for example, right? Which you don't actually do, or you end up, and the Liberal Democrats have done this very well. And they did it on student fees. That was a really good example of that. It was very tempting for them, right in their area of educated people who might be annoyed with the Tories. You end up supporting those, and then you can't deliver for them in office.
Yeah. So I've found the video. So Gary Williamson, he put online, they've only been in power for a few days, but Labour have already confirmed they will concrete over the green belt, false government housing targets on communities, ignore local voices in the planning process. Labour thinks that Whitehall knows better than you. And the first response to it was a man called Kevin Davis, a former Conservative councillor, said, "Mate, stop it, you're being an idiot."
I thought Rachel Reeves's best line was when she was asked about whether she also believed what Liz Truss had said, that there was an anti-growth coalition, and she came straight back saying, Liz Truss was the anti-growth coalition, the Conservatives were, and that the voters had thrown them out, and that is so often true. And we see it in the Greens as well, also opposing solar panel developments, opposing wind farms, because there's always a local reason, there's always a particular piece of field to protect.
Peace is absolutely right. It's going to be an issue for Labour. It's one thing saying this thing on planning, but the reason it fell apart for the Conservatives was they got attacked by the Liberal Democrats. That's what happened. And they were worried about losing their seats.
Well, up next, we'll talk about how then you can keep all your MPs on side and stop them going off and getting lost in local campaigns. So just following on from where we were then, hundreds of new MPs arriving in Parliament literally today. They're going to start taking their seats. They're going to do their swearing in. There's 334 new MPs across all parties. It's which is a big change. How do you keep them on message, in line? How do you stop them going off and being distracted by? Because, you've got dozens, Peter, you've got dozens of Labour MPs who've got Reform in second place. We've got dozens of Labour MPs with the Lib Dems in second place. And they'll be new to it. They'll be bombarded. How do you keep them in line and stop them, panicking about being attacked from the opposition?
You certainly give them a lot to do in Parliament, as much as you can find, whether it be select committees or backbench policy committees and study visits and delegations abroad. You name it. Anyone who stays on the right side of the whips, is going to have, many opportunities, put it that way, to do good for the nation, at home or abroad. This is absolutely wonderful. And they will be these MPs will be approaching this in a sort of in a state variously of sort of delirium or amazement that they're there at all. But you said something before. You said they've got to stick in Parliament and behave rather than keep on local campaigning. I don't think that's the case. I think that the Labour Party will want them, in many cases, not just to participate in Parliament and support the government very actively, but also to go back to their constituencies and organise for this reason. Many of them squeaked in. They don't have huge majorities. In many cases, the Conservatives are second. In other cases, Reform are second. In many of these seats, they won with too little organisation. Now, I know that Labour's campaign machine is now celebrated, and it's an extraordinary sort of data collecting, processing, sort of app-driven sort of 21st century electoral machine. I mean, I am bedazzled by it from what I saw of it. But equally, a lot of these seats were won by Labour MPs where the Labour Party hadn't had an earthly chance of winning for so long, and they just didn't have the organisation, and that's got to be put in place. I don't think it's right that they're going to be running all over the shop and causing problems. You've got to remember that in the sort of Labour Party's new modern selection-assisted process of choosing candidates by Starmer's team, these people are Starmerites. I mean, they're stormtroopers. I mean, almost to a man and a woman. They are. You
look physically pained by that,
and they are not there to cause trouble for Starmer. These are people who...
Storm.
For Starm. These are people who've seen the dysfunction of the Labour Party under Corbyn and certainly don't want to go back to it. So I don't think they're going to be causing trouble. The question, though, is to sort of keep them busy and not idle.
How did the Lib Dems find it going into government in 2010, whereas previously, bluntly, a Lib Dem MP could largely do what they liked, and suddenly having to toe the line and actually vote for a load of stuff that not only did they not personally agree with, but previously hadn't even been Lib Dem policy? I
mean, whipping is always challenging, actually. It's a combination of trying to keep people in order and on the party line, but also actually just practically deploying people to all of the right tasks and the right select committees, the right secondary legislation committees, the right parliamentary delegations, because you do need to keep people busy. I think there's a huge risk from people being bored. And whipping of a large group who don't know each other well, I think is really difficult. So finding ways to support the kind of the relationship building within the parliamentary party, incredibly important. I think actually parliamentary staff are really important. 334 new MPs, that's, 1,000 more really new parliamentary staff. The Labour Party has mobilised to kind of support the process of recruitment for their huge new kind of parliamentary party. But on the opposition benches, they will now have access to short money, which is money that's provided to opposition parties to sort of level up a little bit in comparison with the civil service support. So the Liberal Democrats now with 72 MPs will go up to, more short money than they ever had before, having had tiny amounts to supply a few kind of additional staff who basically provide things like the policy briefings or the debate briefings ahead of moments in Parliament, ahead of select committees, and help MPs try and develop thoughtful policy agendas on issues instead of just being responsive. I'm always against things. And that network of staff, I think, is critical for holding the parliamentary parties together.
Yeah, the one thing that Labour will want to avoid is what I think was fatal for the Conservative Party is the correct collection of these groups that form where people are huddling together because otherwise it's anonymous with very large numbers of people, but then they form views that then develop and begin to develop away from that of the party itself. Clearly part of the opposition to the government in Parliament will be provided by Labour's own MPs, just because almost everybody in Parliament is a Labour MP. So that's just what will happen. It won't be the same, of course, as Tory opposition or Liberal Democrat opposition, but it will be a feature of it. So one of the things that they've got to do is to keep providing arguments to their own, keep having an argument and a dialogue with their own supporters. Because ministers don't need to go to the Commons in order to vote, because the Labour Party's got such a large majority, one of the temptations will be for the ministers never to go, because except when they're doing their own statements, just because they're not needed, and they've got other things to do. That is a mistake, though, because it's when they're in the division lobbies that you can approach people, you can have the conversations, you can get to know people. So making sure the ministers spend enough time in the tea rooms and division lobbies in order to rally their own troops, but also create personal relationships and talent spot. That's going to be very important and easily ignored just because of the simple scale of the majority. There'll be very few set piece occasions where the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary need to go to the Commons, and so therefore they'll end up not going. So they need to talk to their political teams and their diary secretaries right at the beginning, and the whips need to talk to them too, and actually begin to develop a rota where the cabinet is in the Commons enough.
Did you do that in 97?
That's a very good idea. No, we did not do it in 97, and it was a mistake. The discussion that's got to be had by an incoming cabinet minister and his or her diary secretary is very important. I don't know whether anyone has read Gerald Kaufman's book, How to Be a Minister. Screamingly funny. It's the most wonderful account of life as a minister. But he had, he chronicled this tug of war with his diary secretary when he became a minister. They just couldn't understand why he wanted to sort of keep, as it were, white spaces in his diary 2 or 3 times a week, in which he seemed to be doing absolutely nothing at all. In fact, what he was doing was going into the Commons and being there, sitting there, going into the tea room. Not a great man for the strangers' bar, I don't think, but he would have his lunch there once or twice a week in the tea room, and it was really important to keep in touch. He wasn't some extraordinarily ambitious guy who was thinking, how can I garner support for my next leadership bid? He was just being a very sensible minister, and the new ministers should learn from that. Having said they should learn from it, by the way, I do think it behoves members of the last government, just to be very careful not to.
Labour government you're talking about.
Last Labour government, sorry, not spending their time cramping the space of the incomers. I think it behoves us just to sort of step back, give them some space, give them some airtime, not crowd out with our own views, our own running commentary. I think I counted about 11 media bids yesterday to come in and comment on what the new Labour government was coming into me. I turned every single one of them down because I do not.
Knew you were coming here.
Because I'm so loyal, Matt, to your podcast, and secondly, I do not want to be one of those sort of people from the last Labour government who's providing a running commentary on the new one.
But so, are you therefore criticising Tony Blair for speaking out on ID cards? Because I was genuinely baffled by it as on their third day in government. Here's a policy idea.
It was ID cards yesterday, and then it's this terrible backdrop. You need to go in for AI today.
They are having their conference. The conference was booked in advance, so maybe
there's
there's
some. To go on the radio and the TV.
Exactly. I think it's undignified.
I think he does need to. He was right about those things. So why doesn't he just inject them? Why should he do that? I'm perfectly.
Because Keir Starmer is the Prime Minister now.
Well,
and
okay.
he's not.
So I'm not the Prime Minister either, but I've got a view.
But let Peter answer Polly's question.
What was the question?
Are you criticising
You're
Tony?
saying ground
on ID
should
cards.
Zip it. Yeah, and Tony's instead organised a conference and been on the radio and issued a press release and.
I don't know what he's done today, I'm sorry. But on ID cards, I would say this is a very big issue. It's something that the last Labour government started to introduce. Gordon Brown then went a bit cool on it for various reasons. None of us could quite understand why, and then the coalition dropped them. I think the case for EID cards is stronger now than it was then, but I would leave it to the incoming government to consider this and reflect on it and perhaps come back to it in the autumn. I think sort of raising it now and trying to sort of get them to sort of herd them into place just on their third day in office is probably not wise, and it would be better to let them reflect on it over the summer, because I think migration is one of the biggest policy challenges facing this government, and they have got to think afresh about how they manage it. And I think ID cards is something that, in this context does have to be considered, but not to be rushed and not to be, as it were, sort of manhandled into it. And I don't think Tony's trying to do that, by the way.
Well, no, except he put out a policy paper yesterday on ID cards, which is in all the papers. Today's making a speech.
I didn't see that.
Today's making a speech where he'll say that Britain faces an unenviable triple whammy of high taxes, debt and poor outcomes, with the worst to come due to an ageing population, deep structural health problems and rising numbers of long-term sick. He'll go on to say that there's never been a better time to govern, but basically what he's doing is the opposite of what
I would say is that how we're going to face up to these challenges, is just really complicated. There are so many moving policy parts to how we're going to engineer growth and restart it in this country. I think Rachel Reeves and Johnny Reynolds, are they not addressing this in meetings with business leaders and investors today?
The question is whether or not it was helpful.
I can't see a single reason for him not to do that. Of course, it's a different matter if he were to launch a full-scale attack on the government, but providing constructive suggestions, what could possibly be the objection to that? My view, having read a lot of the stuff from the Tony Blair Institute, and particularly on this area of technology, which was quite ignored during the general election, is this very high-quality input, so I don't want to discourage him.
So up next then, we'll turn our attention to the other big question of how to win an election. What should the Tory party be doing right now? So let's turn our attention then to the question of the Tories. How to win an election, how to win a leadership election. Suella Braverman's been out the trap. She attacked her own party when she won a seat. She attacked her own party again in a speech in America. And yet, Danny, it seems like she's already been written out of this race.
Well, I think it's too early probably to say that definitively, but fortunately, it does seem as though this sort of performance isn't impressing very many people. My own view is that the Conservative Party's first job is to just be quiet for a moment and listen to what people have said. Clearly, one of the things that the voters were saying was that they were unimpressed with the chaotic nature of the Conservative Party, that they were unimpressed with the divisions inside the Conservative Party, that they felt the Conservative Party was no longer showed professionalism, and they didn't trust it as a governing party. None of the things that I've seen, even from people with whom I've agreed, have helped really with the task of restoring that, or showed that people are really that reflective about it. So, and quite a lot of the material, quite crude things like suggesting that if you added the reform vote to the Conservative vote, something you absolutely cannot do, that would lead the Conservative Party to have won lots of seats. And that seemed to me, when you look at, say, a seat like Surrey Heath, which was won by the Liberal Democrats, UKIP actually scored more than the Conservative Party, than the Reform Party did in 2015. So, nobody seems to be discussing not just how do you restore the coalition that the Conservative Party had, but whether it was the right coalition. I'm not very impressed with the early parts of the debate, but I do think that will come. The best thing people can do is actually to think about it, to read and look at the data, to discuss it with other Conservatives in a collegiate way. But people seem to be sort of throwing themselves headlong into it with quite unreflective opinions.
But you have to remember that the next leader of the Conservative Party will almost certainly never be the Prime Minister. So I'm always slightly surprised by the number of people who want to sort of throw themselves in when actually what you don't want to be the rebound boyfriend, right? You want to be the boyfriend after the rebound boyfriend. And it is the question really for the Conservative Party is, will the next leader actually take them further away from the centre ground, or will they be somebody who tries to start the journey back to a winning position? It seems at the moment like I haven't really heard any voices other than those people who were sort of thrown out of the parliamentary party by Boris Johnson or who lost along the way, arguing for a journey back to the centre. I mean, Danny obviously is a bit of an exception to that, but he is, of course, in the other house where you don't have to get elected. So the debate for the Conservatives has to be about what path do they want to take next. All of the talks does seem to be about how do we get the Reform voters back, and almost none on how do we get the Lib Dem voters back. That is so different from, I remember in 2000 and whatever it was when David Cameron was elected, he actually launched a website, Lib Dems for Cameron, that was so perfectly judged in terms of its messaging. Like I remember feeling drawn to it, as somebody who was like working for the Lib Dems and thinking, oh, I really do like this stuff. And you have to come up with some, well, maybe he's just lying, or maybe he's a chameleon. That is so different from chasing after the Reform vote. David Cameron won that majority in 2015 by destroying the Liberal Democrats, right? By obliterating that party, taking people who had voted for them in the past and drawing them into his orbit. Unless the Conservative Party is willing to think about that, it won't be ready to win again.
The governed party wins every election. In other words, the party judged by the electorate to be more fit to govern. You could have some arguments about February 1974, but apart from that, it's happened almost every time. And for the Conservative Party to move away from that towards less realistic policies, towards a less sustainable coalition is just, political definition of madness.
Suella Braverman giving her winning speech in Fareham, I just looked at the screen. I thought, what a mean, carping, disloyal individual she is. I mean, who in their right minds would give their support to such a person? I mean, I think she was very lucky to keep her seat. I mean, if she'd been Theresa May, she would have lost, because Theresa's seat was taken by the Liberal Democrats. David Cameron's seat was taken by the Liberal Democrats. Michael Gove's seat was taken by the Liberal Democrats. So she was very lucky. But my question for Danny is, are there more or fewer of these sort of right-wing nut jobs left in the Conservative Party in the House of Commons, or are there more moderates as a result of this meltdown?
It hasn't. The composition hasn't changed that much, but insofar as it has changed, probably the centre and the left of the party, if you want to use a crude phrase, are stronger. There's, by the way, no question the Conservative Party has to address the Reform vote, and although I don't. It was interesting. I did question time with Ben Habib from the Reform Party, and he said something very interesting. He said, the Reform Party is not a right-wing party, and the audience laughed. But I think he's right. Neither the votes for the Reform Party nor the stance that they take actually mean that uniting with them is uniting the right. Yeah. And so you can't see purely this as left and right in the Conservative Party.
It's a challenge for Labour as well, Danny.
Yes.
I mean, there are
yes.
there are millions of people who voted Reform whose support we have to get at the next election. And they're not just voting on economic issues, on cost of living and cost of their mortgages and whatever. There's a sort of cultural difference on impulse and dissatisfaction amongst many voters, and the Labour Party's got to address that and reconnect with those voters if we're going to be winning as well next time.
And that's how to win an election. Would we like to finish off with a Punjabi mix? Of course we would.
Of course.
Timers Radio ਤੇ ਮੈਂ ਚੋਰਲੀ ਨਾਲ ਜੋਨ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਜਿੱਤਣੀ ਹੈ
It's better. I like it. If you want to get in touch...
much nicer than that drill thing.
Yes. If you want to get in touch, you can email howtowin@thetimes.co.uk. You can WhatsApp us 0333 003 2353. This was sent in by Ian. I think it's good.
I love it.
Yeah.
Let's switch to this.
Massive thanks to Peter Mandelson, Polly Mackenzie, and Daniel Finkelstein. How to Win an Election will return next week.